Hello and welcome to Introduction to Diversity, Week 16. To wrap up this class, we're going to be talking about age, disability status, and sexual orientation. Of course, we weren't able to cover all forms of minorities, but this is a very good summary to wrap up. So, prejudice and discrimination is commonly experienced by minorities, often in different ways. Okay, so for this chapter, we're going to be looking at age, disability status, and sexual orientation. These variables are also associated with the experience of unequal treatment globally. Okay, there is age discrimination, there's discrimination against disabilities when it comes to hiring practices and things along those lines, and then there are attitudes and beliefs towards sexual orientations that are also prejudicial and discriminatory. Okay. So, as with all other groups we've studied, people of age, disability status, and sexual orientation, they have a distinctive cultural or physical difference, for example. Of course, age is more obviously physical, disability status has a little bit of a blend of both, and of course, sexual orientation is pure cultural. It's all about the social construction of sexuality, these sexual categories that we have constructed in society, what we consider normal for things like that. Okay, so again, as with all other forms of minorities, membership in these groups is involuntary. You can't choose your age, you can't pick your genetics. Okay, and arguably, and this one comes at great discussion, you know your sexuality is not involuntary either. Okay, yes, of course, sexuality is a blend of the biopsychosocial, but genetics are associated with sexual orientation. So, when it comes to things like how does genetics influence your behavior, the way your brain is structured, the way you think, again, much of sexual orientation is involuntary. Okay, historically, these groups have been susceptible to being negatively stereotyped. We have negative stereotypes about the elderly, there's negative stereotypes about disability, negative stereotypes about sexual orientation. Okay, and these can have incredible effects upon people. And that's why it's very important that, in sociology and other forms, we look at things in ways to kind of level the playing field, to undo these negative stereotypes, to help people fulfill their potential without the discrimination and stigma attached to some of these categories. Okay? So this book talks about the forms of discrimination. Again, it's highly looking at institutional discrimination, which discusses the denying of opportunities based upon some variable: race, age, sex, disability status, things along those lines. Whenever you guys go to fill out any hiring forms, you will always see that on those hiring forms because there's social groups that have come together to enact laws to reduce institutional discrimination. However, as we've learned in this class, institutional discrimination still exists, and a lot of institutional discrimination is based upon negative stereotypes. Okay, and these negative stereotypes influence our attitudes and beliefs, which then influence whether or not we engage in discriminatory practices. Okay, so when you're talking about age, we're looking at ageism, that's prejudice and discrimination against the elderly. Again, older adults often experience unequal treatment. This could be in employment, for example. Okay, if someone goes in to get a job and it requires some physical attribute, and then maybe someone has a stereotype about whether somebody can engage in that physical attribute, these are examples of institutional discrimination. Okay, yes, there is a physical difference between older and younger, of course, but that doesn't mean anything. All it means is that there's an age difference. It's us that attaches meanings to these constructs to make it, whether it's a negative stereotype, for example. Okay, so the book talks about how older people have a strong sense of group solidarity that's reflected in their senior citizen centers, retirement communities, advocacy organizations. Okay, now our attitudes toward age varies by culture. The way we take care of the elderly varies by culture. The way we respect the elderly, for example, varies by culture. But in the United States, there is this exposure and potential exposure to prejudice and discrimination, okay? Because with each subset of groups, there comes these social issues that are important. Children, it's often about nurturing and support and parental environments. As adults, the need for the basics to pay the rent. As elderly, you might have these needs for healthcare and things along those lines. So are we as a society providing for the elderly? Is age causing conflict in society? And then how is the meaning constructed attached to different ages, and how does that affect our life? Okay, so there's just a lot of stuff to age. You have to be thinking about all the different factors of development and psychology and the basic needs and limitations and things along those lines that we should be considering. Okay, but again, we're looking at it from a sociological perspective. So again, we're looking at how things function, the conflict, symbolic interaction, and meaning. Okay. So the disabled is another group that we're covering in this class, and to be disabled means to have a reduced or is considered a reduced ability to perform tasks. Okay, and I look at disabilities and I ask a lot of questions because some things I have to ask questions about, like is autism a disability, for example, or is that just a step in evolutionary evolution? Okay, so there's a lot of questions that you have to ask when it comes to disability. Okay, so is there some kind of an impairment? Maybe a better question. Okay, so this disability status includes everyone who has difficulty carrying things, using wheelchairs, crutches, walkers, psychological considerations. There's many factors attached to what is disabled and what is not. And then again, but you have to realize is it's a cultural definition. It's us as a culture that dictates what is disabled and what is not disabled. Okay, so this idea of the marginalization of people with disabilities, again, our disabilities are very diverse. Each and every human has some kind of disability, inability to engage in some task, for example. But it's how we culturally construct these disabilities and our definitions of what's normal and what's not normal, again, that gets into this kind of gray area of what does it actually mean to have a disability, and is that a fair way of describing people? I mean, I have so many questions, like how do you describe someone who's getting older? Is elderly a better word? Is geriatric a better word? What is politically correct in modern times? I struggle with things like people that getting diagnosed with psychological disorders, because a lot of psychological disorders is influenced by culture. And once we go and label somebody as this or this, what kind of effect does that have on them, for example? So again, the book talks about labeling theory and how labeling and the categories, and once you identify with that category, like identifying as elderly, identifying as disabled, how does that affect you and the psychology of it all? How does that affect the society and the social structures and how you are treated, for example? Does it expose you to these areas of prejudice and discrimination, for example? Just a lot of questions. But again, throughout this whole class, we've been asking the question, how do labels affect us? How does identifying with these groups affect us? How is it associated with our life chances? Okay, so again, this idea of institutional discrimination against the disabled, there's a reason we need these laws, is because of the negative stereotypes. And because here you might have a disabled person who's perfectly capable of working, but then you have a hiring manager that is discriminatory in their hiring practices, for example. That's the idea of institutional discrimination based upon labels or stereotypes, okay? There's many considerations for the disabled, such as accessibility, but this is the way it should be in all things. All walks of life should be open to those of society if we're going to have an equitable world, okay? Yeah, we need to be able to rise up the social class ladder based upon meritocracy, but how do we help everybody, be able to, live out their full potential, to be able to fulfill what they're able to do with their lives? And this is the idea of accessibility, which again has been supported in the laws, and this is the idea again of leveling the playing field, for example. So when it comes to sexuality, this is a really tough subject, and we talk about sexuality in my psychology classes, in sociology classes. It's part of being human. It's something we have to discuss. As with race, I've thrown out some challenging ideas, like are you actually white? Are you actually black? Is race really a thing? How many races do we really need to account for the spectrum, the continuum of race, the blend, the diversity of race? And the same thing goes with sexuality. Again, sexuality ranges from straight to homosexual, or straight to gay, or what other word should we use? Again, we're in this non-straight to non-straight. Is that the best way? Same-sex versus not same-sex. So whatever words you guys prefer, again, it's a new world. We're creating vocabulary as we go. We're deciding what's politically correct. Is it politically correct to call somebody gay? Is homosexual a more preferred word? So again, whenever you're teaching, whenever you're talking about this stuff, you are always asking big questions. But over my learning about sexuality, the thing that really got me in the end is that we all range sexually somewhere between the two polars, between homosexual and non-homosexual, between straight and not straight, okay? So gender and sex exist along a continuum. And this goes for biology and perception. So when it comes to the sexes, we have this category, a third category in modern times called intersex. And 2 out of every 100 are born with ambiguous genitalia or chromosomes, for example. And often this gets into procedures where doctors make decisions and they decide whether they need to construct a vagina or whether they need to construct a penis. And a lot of this happens at birth, but this is going on in 2 out of 100. So even our sexes exist along a continuum. Some people are born with 2 vaginas. Some people that are born with a vagina and breast have high levels of testosterone because of androgen levels in their womb. So if you have a female that has a vagina and breast but has high levels of testosterone, for example, they might find themselves, maybe attracted to a male, for example. Or, so how does all this biology work? It's very confusing. I get it. But again, sex, our sex, and sexuality and gender is a very complicated process. It's a biopsychosocial process. How much of your genetics are associated with your sexuality and what you are attracted to, for example. How much of what you're attracted to is based upon cognitions and how much is based upon the social context. So again, if I'm a white female attracted to a black male biologically, and in my brain and my cognitions, I'm saying I want that person. However, I know that let's say it's 1950. Even if a white woman was attracted to someone that identified as black, they couldn't act on it in the social context out of fear of being lynched, for example. So our sexuality is a biopsychosocial process. It's a blend of our genetics, our cognitions, and then the social context. What are we able to achieve in modern times, okay? So sexuality exists along a continuum. All of us range from straight to non-straight, and I would highly like to argue that very few of us are exclusively straight or exclusively homosexual. And that's a challenging idea, but when you start to look at the spectrum of sexuality, same thing when it comes to gender, that spectrum between male and female and all the categories in between, we all have a little bit of different ideas about things. Okay, and so one thing to challenge yourself is, what would you do if there weren't the categories? How would you actually behave if there were no such categories as straight or gay, as male or female? Because if you're a male, for example, and then you kind of stop identifying exclusively as male and open yourself up to the feminine experience, you might find that you're a much more fulfilled, self-actualized person. Okay, because to be male, what do? You do everything that's not female, right? So we kind of cut ourselves off from an entire way of life the second we identify as a male. So again, these categories that you identify with as a male, as straight, as white, as whatever, this then affects the way you think. It affects the way you behave, okay? So there's a lot to this, but the main point of, this whole idea about sexual orientation is it exists along a continuum, okay? Historically, identifying as not straight was labeled as a psychological disorder. And it wasn't until the 1970s that culture finally caught up when we realized that sexuality exists along a continuum. It's perfectly normal. However, we do need some social controls, not to control people from being gay or straight, but pedophilia, getting with animals, things like that. There are some social structures that should be imposed to limit human sexuality. Trust me, we need laws. Okay, I like the laws about, being 18 and consent, and all of this are good. However, the bad laws are the idea that, 2 men shouldn't be allowed to get married, which is why I'm very glad that has changed. It's a great time to be living. Because, again, this idea of the closet is one of the most upsetting things to me as a sociologist. Because the fact is, why is there a closet in the first place? And that's where you start to see prejudice and discrimination. Because there is a closet because people that identified as not straight couldn't safely be themselves in society out of stigmas, prejudice, discrimination, etc. Okay, these negative stereotypes. And it was often very dangerous too. Just like an interracial couple in 1950, that was dangerous. Was it dangerous in 1750? No, totally normal. But by, 1950, it was dangerous, okay? So the idea of the closet upsets me because of the fact that we've had to force people to be in the closet. And we as a society, again, should free everybody up to participate. Okay? However, attitudes toward homosexuality, attitudes toward race and age, their negative stereotypes still exist, which is why it's imperative that we continuously reconstruct the meanings attached to these categories, reconstruct the meanings attached to age, to disability status. Like literally, I'm questioning all the time, why is one thing labeled a disability? Why can't we just call it normal? Okay, so I have some radical ideas in some of these subjects. But again, this idea of categorizing people, well, the categories have a major effect on people. That's why I started to question the categories. Going back in human history, okay, there have been times in human history where homosexuality was totally normal, times where it was completely taboo and you could be killed for it. Remember that our most famous conqueror, Alexander the Great, was a homosexual. I mean, it was very common back then. Men were always having sex with men back then. It was just totally normal. And then, depending on the culture and the country and what time, what epoch we're in, that influences our attitudes toward this and that. Okay, 200 years ago, a lot of racism. Nowadays, no racism, not as much. Okay, depending on the epoch, depending on the attitude. So interracial marriage in 1980, only 500,000, now 5 million. What happened? Our attitudes changed, okay? So attitudes change, and that affects society, and that affects how we socialize people into our society, for example, okay? So again, when you're looking at sexuality, it's a biopsychosocial. Are genetics associated with homosexuality? Absolutely. What you are attracted to is a physiological process. Think about your emotions. Think about the way you feel, guys. That's your body. You're attracted to some things and you're attracted to others. That's not just your conscious mind. That's your unconscious mind and your hormones releasing signals through your bloodstream to talk to your brain using some neurotransmitters to tell you that you're interested in something. Okay, so attraction, arousal, this is all a combination of biopsychosocial, okay? So genetics, brain structure, cognitions, the social context, all of that is associated with our sexuality, how we express our sexual self, and our sexual orientation, what we identify with, okay? So you always got to be looking at genetics, psychology, social context to understand anything in modern times. So advocacy in modern times, we've talked a lot about all the different movements, okay? And these movements exist for a reason. Much of it is to reduce prejudice and discrimination and to increase life chances, okay? So we've talked about the workers' rights, women's rights, you've got the sexual orientation rights, racial rights, ethnic rights, farm workers, so much when it comes to social movements. If you ever get a chance to take a class on social movements, usually they offer them about junior or senior year. I highly recommend that because that is a wonderful class to take, and it really gets into all the different movements and the outcomes and whether they were effective and what was effective about it, for example. But what we've seen is that over the last 100 years, civil rights has improved, equity has improved. However, there is still a disparity between rich and middle class and poor, for example, but things are improving, okay? So that's the most important thing we're going to focus on a nice, happy finishing thought, is that we are embracing diversity, we are cutting through some of these old stereotypes, old adages, old ideas. We're challenging with new ideas like questioning our races, questioning our sexual orientations, asking really big questions, looking at biology and psychology and sociology and history and philosophy and economics to make sense of how society works. Okay? And what we're seeing is things are improving, and that's just, one humbled person's kind of perspective on that. You guys will have to go out and see for yourself whether the world is improving, okay? But we've had a lot of advocacy rights working for all these different groups, Native American issues, disabled persons issues, elderly people's issues, women's issues. People are fighting for us, and I'm glad that it's still continuing, okay? Thank you so much for this class. It's been an absolute honor. If you have any questions, please email, and thank you so much, and have a wonderful day.